The last time we left off on the mystery book was when we were talking about the surprise meeting with Henry Kissinger doing a surprise meeting on Donald Trump or something. So we're going to read a little bit more. Yeah, it was an unexpected visit. So we're going to read a little bit more. This is chapter 3 still. I asked Patrick Wood to explain how the Trilateral Commission fed into the World Economic Forum and the Great Reset, and as usual, he had a clear and concise answer. Back in the early days of the Trilateral Commission, they were very reticent to come out and speak about their plans. They did it every once in a while, but we beat them up so badly they decided not to come out and play anymore. They were relatively secretive about their plans and operations. Even David Rockefeller, in his memoirs, admitted that they were very secretive about their meetings and plans. By comparison, the World Economic Forum is made up of the same type of people as the Trilateral Commission, but it has a much broader membership. You have the media, you have the lawyers, the politicians, the CEOs of the giant companies. It was the same kind of people you saw in the Trilateral Commission. It has a much broader membership and a much larger one, but still the same mix of people as you saw in the Trilateral Commission. However, the World Economic Forum is completely open about their plans. They have an extensive website with tons and tons of articles that you could get lost in. In the articles, they declare exactly what their plans are. It's also important to note that the World Economic Forum is so tightly wedded to the United Nations that it can be hard to see where the two groups differ at all. Woods describes the path trod by many revolutionary groups, from the communists of Russia and China to the fascists of Italy and to the Nazis of Germany. If you know the public isn't going to support your message, you lie about your ultimate plans. You convince the good people to surrender or stay silent as you implement your plans. I asked Wood if it was accurate to say that Klaus Schwab and the World Economic Forum were using issues such as sustainable development, climate change, and racism and gender issues as a way to divide people, making them more vulnerable to the plans of the globalists. He agreed it was a tactic they used, but said it was also a strategy to keep people from looking too closely at their plans. The World Economic Forum is to complete the plans of the new International Economic Order and the Trilateral Commission. That's what the Great Reset is all about. It's been 45, 50 years in the making. The Great Reset is the new International Economic Order. This is technocracy warmed over from the 1930s. It's a resource-based system where they will control all the resources, and you and I will own nothing. And you and I will own nothing. Oh yeah, because that very famous quote, you will own nothing and be happy. In fact, Klaus Schwab even says that, and you can look that up. Sometimes your understanding of an issue depends on when you enter the conversation. If you had entered the conversation within the last 10 years, you might think this all began with Klaus Schwab, the World Economic Forum, and the Fourth Industrial Revolution. However, you'd be sorely mistaken. If you just focused on the work of the Trilateral Commission, you look to Henry Kissinger, David Rockefeller, Zbigniew Brzezinski in the early 1970s. However, you'd fail to see the links going back to the 1930s and Columbia University. That's why it's often so enlightening to talk to an expert like Patrick Wood. An expert can give a deep historical perspective of an issue that you wouldn't otherwise understand. Probably one of the most surprising parts of my interview with Patrick Wood was when he talked about how oblivious many of the early members of the Trilateral Commission were to the unpopularity of their ideas among the public. Wood recalls, there was a paternalistic attitude by the members of the Trilateral Commission regarding the rest of the world. They figured since they were the bright ones, the ones with PhDs and that sort of stuff, that they had a leg up on everybody else in deciding what was good and what was bad. We repeatedly ran into this attitude where what they'd say is something like, well, what we're doing is for everybody's good. It's for the global good. So why would anybody take exception to it? We took exception to it and we told them that, but they just couldn't understand why we'd be upset about their plans to help the world. It was just crazy. I still shake my head. This is really the heartbeat of what I call scientism. Scientism sets up science as a god, and as a god that can do no wrong. And they reject any other type of moral, ethical, or biblical restraint. It doesn't matter. All of this is just nonsense to them. And they believe the God of science is the only path to finding out about the nature of man and the universe. This allows them to come up with some very strange ideas about their way of being, the only sensible way. And everybody else with a different idea is a crackpot. I found Patrick Wood's comments to be extremely helpful in explaining the mindset of these globalist technocrats. They genuinely believed what they were saying. They think the rest of us are idiots in need of being saved by them. They reject all other resources or all other sources of morality, be it religious, ethical, or moral. It is accurate to call them materialists, and yet even the most ardent materialist can still live an ethical life if they respect the rights of others just as much as they respect these rights for themselves. In some ways, it's quite sad. As one might say, these globalists suffer from a God-shaped hole in their soul, where God used to be, and are desperately trying to fill this void with the God of scientism. They do not engage with the moral and spiritual complexities of life, and thus most closely resemble a general who conducts a battle far from the front, forever blind to what's happening at the tip of the spear, where success or failure is determined. They live an antiseptic life, devoid of all joy and suffering, and pass from this world with little or no spiritual development. The next subject I covered in my conversation with Wood was my frustration with something I couldn't find in the writings of Klaus Schwab or the globalists. Their writings spoke abundantly of communication, collaboration, and a common set of values, but contained little information about what happened to those who, after a period of communication, simply didn't agree to their common set of values. I asked if Wood could point me to any sources that explained how these globalists plan to deal with the dissenters. This was his response. We can certainly see the anecdotal evidence for that with all the people who've been canceled, kicked out, thrown out, shamed, and in some cases probably murdered. The pattern has been very clear. Anybody who does not agree with their narrative is in jeopardy of being removed from the scene. It's kind of what China does. In China, they call it disappearing people. They haven't gone quite that far in the West to specifically kill somebody yet, but disappearing people is the name of the game. We see this in the medical community. For example, the Great Barrington Declaration opposing the COVID-19 lockdowns, masking regulations, and vaccine mandates had a couple 100,000 signatures, with about 3,000 being top scientists and medical professionals. Every one of those people were canceled by the censorship culture, and that wasn't by mistake. It was an international campaign to crush anybody who had an alternative narrative to COVID-19. And we see this all over the major media, social media, and with many large corporations who are censoring people they don't like for one reason or another. I found it difficult to disagree with anything that Wood was claiming. Anybody paying attention to the media understands that. In the past several years, especially since the appearance of COVID-19, there has been nothing less than an assault on free speech. The old answer to the question of speech that people believe to be wrong is more speech to counter what is believed to be false. The answer to bad speech is good speech and trusting people to be able to tell the difference. This principle no longer seems to be part of the operating system of our civilization. Instead, the motives of the speaker were attacked, usually with some of the most heinous allegations possible today, and that person was removed from the discussion on the grounds that many found the comments objectionable, or that such speech created a significant risk of public harm. If we lose free speech, we lose our ability to think and can only blindly follow the dictates of those who believe they have our best interests at heart. One of the final questions I wanted Patrick Wood to address was something that has long bothered me, because our tradition of free speech in the West, as well as individual autonomy, we have a different operating system than an individual in China or Russia, which have a long history of cowering under the dictates of the latest authoritarian ruler. Although there have been suspicious deaths of dissidents in the West, I'd agree that little hard evidence has been presented to establish this as a pattern utilized by the powerful in our society. I asked Wood whether he agreed that in the West it would be difficult to force these changes upon us, but if they could somehow get people to acquiesce to their plans or remain silent, that it would greatly increase their chances of success. In other words, they could not succeed by force. However, they could succeed by subterfuge or somehow obtaining our consent, such as the old superstition about how a vampire could not enter a house without the invitation of the homeowner. We needed to invite or at least acquiesce to the entry of the vampire of globalism into our house. Wood detailed a specific change to the strategy of the globalists that came about around 1974. Richard Gardner, a founding member of the Trilateral Commission and a professor, wrote an article in 1974 in Foreign Affairs magazine with the title, The Hard Road to World Order. You can find it on the internet. It's been scanned. What he said, and this is a direct quote, was, "It will look like a great booming, buzzing confusion, but an end run around national sovereignty." I need to say that again because I just kept fumbling on my words. "It will look like a great booming, buzzing confusion, but an end run around national sovereignty, eroding it piece by piece, will accomplish much more than the old-fashioned frontal assault." End quote. The game changed in 1973 with the formation of the Trilateral Commission. Prior to that, you had the old-fashioned frontal assault. Then Gardner was saying there needed to be an end run around national sovereignty. And that's exactly what they've done for the past 45 or 50 years, chipping away death by 1,000 cuts, piece by piece, eroding national sovereignty. Probably the best example today is the European Union, or the EU. The EU has taken over virtually every single function of the countries that it presides over. You can say on one hand, there's still a national government in Spain, Switzerland, and Germany. Yes, there is. But do they have the same power today that they had, say, 30 years ago? No, of course they don't. The EU is now making all of the significant policy decisions for Europe for those individual countries. This has been the standard operating procedure for technocracy, to chip away at national sovereignty and eventually remove the political structure altogether. That's been a goal since the 1930s. If one looks at the globalists like any other revolutionary movement, it becomes easy to understand their tactics. A frontal assault on the institutions of government was not likely to lead to success. Instead, it was important for them to work incrementally, The globalists are not patient. Or wait, they're nothing if not patient. So they are patient. As we wrapped up our interview, Wood suggested 3 things to me. First, he suggested I reread Brave New World, written by Aldous Huxley in 1933. I actually want to read that book myself, too. The same year, technocracy established itself at Columbia University. In Brave New World, there's no political structure. The world is run by the scientists and the engineers. The book was a direct attack on technocracy, so I suggest you reread it to see what things have come to pass and what might be ahead. Second, he suggested I simply go to the website for the World Economic Forum and read their papers. It's all out in the open, he said. Third, he suggested I read the work of Israeli academic Yuval Harari, probably the most important advisor to Klaus Schwab. If you want to understand Klaus Schwab, you need to understand Yuval Harari. He's got some pretty strange ideas. He's all about transhumanism and the singularity. His latest book is called Homo Deus, which means man is now God. Gives you a good idea of the man's humility. Oh yeah. I promised to do all those things, but first had some other questions. I wanted to know more about David Rockefeller's book, where he discussed the early Trilateral Commission in the book Between Two Ages, which first brought Columbia University professor Zbigniew Brzezinski to the attention of the aged billionaire. In 2002, when he was 87 years old, David Rockefeller published his 517-page autobiography, Memoirs. Chapter 27 is titled Proud Internationalist and details some of his pursuits in that area. After opening with a day in his life, October 23rd, 1995, in which he met various friends at the 50th anniversary of the United Nations, including Fidel Castro, Rockefeller then turned to his critics. For more than a century, ideological extremists at either end of the political spectrum have seized upon well-publicized incidents, such as my encounter with Castro, to attack the Rockefeller family for the inordinate influence they claim we wield over American political and economic institutions. Some even believe we are part of a secret cabal working against the best interests of the United States, characterizing my family and me as internationalists, and of conspiring with others around the world to build a more integrated global political and economic structure, one world, if you will. If that's the charge, I stand guilty and I am proud of it. And that's what David Rockefeller said. It's a bold paragraph, which does several things. First, he paints himself as a centrist by claiming that he's attacked by ideological extremists at either end of the political spectrum. He mentions the claims of those who assert he's part of a group of internationalists, and instead of denying these claims, he proudly confesses to being a supporter of an integrated global political and economic structure, one world, if you will. It's a disarming approach. And yet he also engages in the demonization of his enemies. While you may believe the populist label is a new insult wielded by the left, it's a little surprising to read the vitriol with which Rockefeller uses the populist label against his enemies on the right or left in 2002. The anti-Rockefeller focus of these otherwise incompatible political positions owes much to populism. Populists believe in conspiracies. And one of the most enduring is that a secret group of international bankers and capitalists and their minions control the world's economy. Because of my name and prominence as the head of Chase for many years, I've earned the distinction of conspirator in chief from some of these people. Let's imagine we put David Rockefeller in the witness chair of a courtroom and cross-examine him. He's the head of one of the largest banks in the world and criticizes his critics of the left and right. Who question how Rockefeller and his fellow rich people are manipulating the world's economy. If we weren't dazzled by Rockefeller's wealth, would we accept him as a credible person to discount the claim that wealthy bankers were controlling a lot of the world? No, we would not. Rockefeller used much the same approach of lightheartedly dismissing his critics when he discussed the establishment of the Trilateral Commission. Rockefeller wrote, "No organization with which I have played a founding role has attracted as much public scrutiny and attention as the Trilateral Commission. Pat Robertson has insisted that Trilateral is trying to create a world government and claims that it springs from the depths of something evil. My son Richard, when he was a student at Harvard in the 1970s, told me his friends assumed that Trilateral was part of a nefarious conspiracy." End quote. If we have a little different take on what Rockefeller is saying, he admits that presumably some of the smartest students in the country, those at Harvard University, didn't trust the Trilateral Commission. But Rockefeller did provide information about the founding of the Trilateral Commission and admits it was his idea. The idea for an organization including representatives from North America, Europe, and Japan, the three centers of democratic capitalism, resulted from my realization in the early 1970s that power relationships in the world had fundamentally changed. The United States, although still dominant, had declined relatively in terms of its economic power, as both Western Europe and Japan recovered from the devastation of World War II and entered a period of dramatic economic growth and expansion. As a result, the comedy that characterized relationships among these regions for more than 2 decades had deteriorated alarmingly, and I believed something needed to be done. When it comes from Rockefeller's own pen, it's easy to understand why some populists might call him the conspirator in chief. In his mind, he was certainly the founder. However, if one is to believe Rockefeller's account of what happened next, it's as if his simple charitable plan caused him to be accidentally swept up into the winds of history. We cast our nets widely in terms of membership and recruited labor union leaders, corporate CEOs, prominent Democrats and Republicans, as well as distinguished academics, university presidents, and the heads of nonprofits involved overseas. We assembled what we believed were the best minds in America. The Europeans and Japanese assembled delegations of comparable distinction. How could anybody possibly object to one of the world's richest men bringing together the most powerful and influential people of America and Western Europe and Japan? Of course, the rich and powerful always have such get-togethers because they want to do enormous good for the common people. The very idea that such get-togethers might be to retain or increase their power in an increasingly democratic world, well, it should be banned from all media. And it was certainly a complete coincidence that among that first group of American politicians invited onto the Trilateral Commission was one who would go on to grab the ultimate prize. The inclusion among that first group of an obscure Democratic governor of Georgia, James Earl Carter, had an unintended consequence. A week after Trilateral's first executive committee meeting in Washington, in December 1975, Governor Carter announced that he would seek the Democratic nomination for President of the United States. I have to confess that at the time, I thought he had little chance of success. Much to my amazement, however, he not only won the Democratic nomination, but defeated President Ford in the November election. Now, even though James Earl Carter was an obscure Democratic governor of Georgia, what might have made him such an attractive recruit for the Trilateral Commission? Could it have been that he was trained in the Navy as a nuclear engineer, making him an ideal acolyte for this new religion of scientism in which engineers and scientists would be the new high priests? The parade of good news for the members of the newly formed Trilateral Commission just kept coming in. As Rockefeller recounted, Carter's campaign was subtly anti-Washington and anti-establishment, and he pledged to bring both new faces and new ideas into government. There was a good deal of surprise. There was a good deal of surprise then when he chose 15 members of Trilateral, many of whom had served in the previous administrations of his team, including Vice President Mondale, Secretary of State Cyrus Vance, Secretary of Defense Harold Brown, Secretary of Treasury Michael Blumenthal, and Zbigniew Brzezinski as National Security Advisor. In his 1975 autobiography, Why Not the Best?, Carter wrote that membership on this commission has provided me with a splendid learning opportunity, and many of the other members have helped me in the study of foreign affairs. That must have set some all-time political record. From starting your organization in 1973 to winning the presidency in 1976, and stalking the cabinet with fellow members. And while some who know their history will no doubt recollect that Carter quickly became bogged down in various problems, such as the Iranian hostage crisis, runaway inflation, gas shortages, and even a new president from the opposing party, couldn't seem to break free of the Trilateral Commission. Rockefeller wrote, in the 1980 presidential primary campaign, for instance, one of Ronald Reagan's supporters ran an advertisement that stated, "The people who brought you Jimmy Carter now want you to vote for George Bush," and highlighted the membership of both in Trilateral. But of course, nobody would freaking know what they were talking about. So I'm not sure how many votes were changed by this ad, but such is the nature of politics in a democratic society. I should note, however, that President Reagan ultimately came to understand the Trilateral's value and invited the entire membership to a reception at the White House in April 1984. When I read that paragraph, it only brings a sense of sadness to me, seeming to show that Reagan also had to eventually knuckle down to the power of the globalists. Maybe he just wanted to keep his enemies close. Maybe it was simply about retaining power, the common flaw of most political leaders. I will give the final word to David Rockefeller from the end of his chapter, Proud Internationalist. These organizations reflect my belief in the principle of constructive engagement. As an intelligence officer during World War II, I learned that my effectiveness depended on my ability to develop a network of people with reliable information and influence. So reliable information and influence. Some may feel this technique is cynical and manipulative. Well, because it is. That's all it is. Everything is manipulated. We manipulate our own reality. So it's just a fact. Anyway, but then other people take it to a different level. They manipulate other people's lives. They try to, but then again, at the same sense, like everybody is responsible for making that decision. So we can still get mad. Yes, we can get mad at the people that are obviously manipulating, right? But the other issue at hand is you still have to blame the person that is allowing themselves to be manipulated. I mean, they have to take responsibility for it. It's just like the saying where somebody gets beaten down over and over again by their boyfriend or girlfriend, and they break up and then, get back together, break up and, get back together. If eventually when they break up for good, depending on how they view it, it's like one's going to either blame the other or they're going to take accountability for the mistake they chose to make, that they allowed themselves themselves to be continuously tortured. They tortured themselves. They allowed it to happen. If you don't learn from your mistake, it's going to repeat itself. And you cannot blame anybody for it. You have to take accountability for it. So, okay. Some may feel this technique is cynical and manipulative. I disagree. This is what David Rockefeller is saying, by the way. Such an approach enabled me to meet people who were useful in advancing goals and gave me opportunities to form lasting friendships that have greatly enriched my life. Well, of course, David. Of course, David. Of course you'd say that. And that's okay. That's the way you want to do it. I will leave it to you to decide whether that passage comforts you in the belief that the wealthy and powerful are looking out for your best interests, or whether that passage fills you with stark, raving terror. It doesn't fill me with terror. I'll tell you that. It just fills me with like, okay, well, that's not surprising, if anything. It's not shocking to me. So, let's see how much more I have in chapter 3. I mean, there's quite a bit more before I can read the rest of this one. This is a long chapter. That's for damn sure. It's a really long chapter. I think I'm going to end it there for now. And then we have like a couple more pages till chapter 3, or till chapter 4, I mean. So yeah, I think that's good for now. So we'll leave it up on there and we'll continue reading about the Rockefellers.